that, and I highly recommend Tim's book on prosperity without growth. I think he and I think Peter are all going to give you pretty much the same message, maybe from slightly different points of view and emphasizing slightly different things. So I'm not going to say anything that conflicts in any way, I think, with what Tim just said. You can go to the next slide. And I think his last point, that what's really needed is a new paradigm, is one that I want to start off with. That to solve complex problems like the ones we're facing is going to take a new vision, not only of how the world works, how the economy fits into the biosphere, but also how we would like the world to be, what our goals are. And I think our goals need to shift away from merely increasing GDP, which is just one means to the ultimate end of sustainable human prosperity, and towards that goal explicitly. How do we create a world where we can have prosperity and sustainability, but not necessarily growth in the conventional sense, as Tim says, that may be necessary in some parts of the world, but overall, I think it's something that we can no longer deal with if we want to solve the problems that we're facing. We need new tools and analytical techniques. We need new implementation strategies and institutions, I think, to achieve that new vision. And I think all of those things have to be done in an integrated way. Okay, next slide. Just to put a little more detail behind it, I think part of the issue is that we used to live in a relatively empty world, empty of humans and their artifacts. We had frontiers. And I think our economic models were created in that empty world context. And this is a model of, I think, what the empty world vision looks like. We have the three primary factors of land, labor, and capital, but land is sort of grayed out in this slide to emphasize the fact that there was an assumption of almost perfect substitutability for land and natural resources. We could really do without land and natural resources in this vision, because we could always substitute more capital or labor for that factor of production. Produce goods and services which are either consumed by people in the current period or reinvested to create more capital so that we can have more goods and services in the future. You can see that there's nothing in this vision of the world, this empty world vision, that limits the growth of the economy indefinitely, and that consumption is the primary contributor to human welfare. So the basic premises are more is always better. This economy can grow forever. Poverty can best be solved with more growth. A rising tide lifts all boats, as the adage. And nature is sort of a sideshow in this vision, something we can have if we have enough resources, but we can also do without. And that private property rights are the best way to handle everything, because we're mainly concerned about liable and excludable goods and services that can be easily privatized. Go to the next slide. But we're not in that empty world context any longer. We're now in a full world context, and we have to re-ask this question: what really is the economy? It's not, I would argue, just the market, and it's not just for increasing the value of marketed goods and services as measured by GNP, what we conventionally think of as growth. Let's go to the next slide. It has a different vision, and this full world model recognizes that we live in a materially closed Earth system. It recognizes that the four basic types of capital are not infinitely substitutable for each other, but are required in some sort of balanced way to produce anything, really, including conventional goods and services, but also things that are not marketed, that directly affect human well-being, the services of social capital and natural capital, ecosystem services, as they're called. So without going into too much detail on this, I think the other major point is that human well-being is a much more complex function, as we now know, due to the emerging science of happiness, than merely the more we consume, the better off we are. It depends up to a point on consumption, but beyond that point, more consumption can actually get in the way of well-being, as it takes time away from other contributions, as Tim was mentioning, of social capital, having time to be with friends and family and being in nature. So it's a very different vision of the world. And also the property rights regimes, I think, need to be much more nuanced and complex to recognize that many types of capital, particularly natural and social capital, and non-liable, non-excludable, not really amenable to private property rights, but we need to do something other than leave them as open access resources. Next slide. This graph just shows the relationship between GDP per capita on the x-axis and happiness or well-being on the y-axis as measured by surveys of people around the world. And it does make this point that there's sort of an optimal level of consumption, and you can go too far. Beyond a certain point, the relationship really flattens out, that more GDP per capita doesn't really lead to more life satisfaction. Below that point, it certainly does. And so, as Kim was saying, there are two parts to this graph, and we should really be trying to converge on this optimal point where we have enough to support our well-being, but not so much that it's wasteful. Now, if there were no side effects to this additional growth, then so what? And I think that's been the underlying assumption. That more is always better if there are no side effects. But there are significant side effects, as we know now, climate change being not the least of them. And so it's damaging overall to go beyond that optimal point. For the next slide. As this graph indicates, GDP was never designed as a measure of economic welfare or well-being. It's merely a measure of economic activity. And so that activity can have both positive and negative aspects. And this is just a graph of GDP in the U.S. from 1950 to recently, compared to GPI, or the Genuine Progress Indicator. The GPI includes adjustments. It subtracts some of the negative aspects of GDP, like the cost of crime, the cost of loss of leisure time, and the damages to natural capital assets, the cost of air and water pollution, etc. It also adjusts for the increasing gap, or the gap in income distribution, recognizing that a dollar's worth of income to a rich person doesn't produce as much additional welfare as a dollar's worth of income to a poor person. GDP takes no account of the distribution of income, only measuring gross income, but that distribution is very important to well-being, not the least because it contributes to social capital, but also because of this decreasing marginal returns of income to welfare. You can see that GPI in the U.S. and in many other countries correlated with GDP for a while, up until, in the U.S. case, about 1975, and then it's sort of flattened out and hasn't really been improving at all. This means that we're in a period now of what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth. The economy is growing, but it's not economic because it's not really producing increasing well-being. So this makes the point that this fetish and focus on GDP growth is really misguided because it's not really improving our well-being. It's not sustainable, as we know, because of its impacts on climate change and other environmental issues, but it's also not desirable. It's not really improving our well-being.